It can be sown early and spread the autumn workload. Obviously, we've had a lot of poor autumns in the last few years, and there's a tendency to sow early, but you tend to increase your risk in terms of BYDV, take-all, particularly if you're going into those risk slots. But the rye does allow us to sow that bit earlier, and you can spread your workload maybe without taking as much risk as you are with other crops.
Growing new crops can be challenging, especially when it comes to adapting advice to your own farm. Rye is a relatively new option. It is straightforward to grow if you know the basics. The big question remains, is there a market for it? You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We'd really appreciate it if you could listen, follow and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast from. At the recently held Teagasc Crops Forum, one of the key themes was the role of rye, from the production to feeding it to pigs and the potential in the circular economy. Dr. Richie Hackett from Teagasc explains how to grow the crop and highlighted the main markets. If you didn't catch the forum, his talk is definitely worth a listen.
It's a relatively new crop in Ireland, but it's grown in a lot of European countries, in the likes of Denmark, Germany, East European countries, and back in, before about the 60s, it was probably the main cereal crop in the likes of Germany, and they like it a lot for both animal feed, but also for human consumption. They like rye products, rye bread, and that sort of thing. And it's probably used a lot in those countries because it's very good on lighter or poorer soils, and that's the type of soils they grow it on over there. What can it be used for? It can be used for human consumption. As I mentioned, it's used for the likes of rye bread and biscuits and that sort of thing. It can be used as an animal feed, in pig feed, which is probably one of its big uses internationally as well. And it can also be used for producing whiskey. Some of you might be aware of a whiskey that's produced down in Middleton that's made from rye. I suppose in terms of what we're talking about, there's different types of varieties. In the past, a lot of the varieties were population types. We'd call them non-hybrids, I suppose, but they're population types. They're not really grown to any great extent in Ireland anyway, and even abroad. The hybrid varieties have taken over, mainly because they have higher yields. You're talking 10, maybe 20% higher yield from the hybrids versus the older non-hybrid types. It has been around in the past, but the current hybrids are sort of a relatively new crop in Ireland. And when we started this work back in late 2018, there was relatively little Irish agronomic knowledge. We were relying on what came from abroad. And we were lucky enough to get some funding from the Department of Agriculture looking at non-barley grains for use in the distilling industry or the drinks industry. And as part of that, we included some work on the agronomy of rye. A lot of the information you'll see today, which is based on that work. So why would you use rye? Why would you include rye in your rotation? Well, I suppose the first and most important characteristic of it is what you need from any crop is that it's got high yield, and particularly when sown early or in take-all slots, that's when it really comes to its fore. So this is sort of two examples of we've grown it in comparison to winter wheat and winter barley. This is where we've compared it to winter wheat, and we've compared it to winter wheat after a break crop, so a first wheat, and we've also compared it as the second crop after a break crop, which is sort of your take-all risk slot. And what we've generally found, this is just sort of two particular experiments, but this is sort of typical of what we found, is after the break crop, it gives similar yields to the winter wheat, sometimes a little bit better. It's often, we've often grown it after oilseed rape as the break crop, and as we'll see later on, slugs can sort of affect your yield in that case, so it might be holding the rye back a little bit in that case. But when you go after the second crop after the break crop, that's when it really comes into its own. It's got good tolerance of take-all. It does get take-all. It's not a take-all break crop, so the crop that you grow after this will be susceptible to take-all, but it really performs in that case, and you get a higher yield and often at a lower nitrogen input, and we'll come back to that in a minute. I'll come back to this slide a few times during the presentation. But it performs very well in both in a first crop or a second crop situation. We've compared it to barley as well, and these experiments were really set up to look at BYDV, but they give you an example of how it can compare to winter barley in that sort of second crop after a break slot. And In this case, it was always sown early, so we're sowing it around the 20th of September to ensure that we were getting BYDV. But these, what I'm showing you here was all got two insecticide sprays, both the rye and the barley, and you can see that the rye was way outperforming the barley, up to 2 tonnes a hectare of a yield benefit of the rye compared to barley in that sort of slot, that almost, you call it almost a graveyard slot. So it has the potential to give very high yield in those sort of tricky slots. I suppose the other thing about it is it can be sown early and spread the autumn workload. Obviously, we've had a lot of poor autumns in the last few years, and there's a tendency to sow early. And you know, sowing, you can sow barley, you can sow wheat early, but you tend to increase your risk in terms of BYDV, take all, particularly if you're going into those risk slots. But the rye does allow us to sow that bit earlier, and you can spread your workload maybe without taking as much risk as you are with other crops. This is some work where we looked over 3 years, where we looked at a range of sowing dates started from mid-September to sort of early November. And we measured yield at each of those dates. And what we were finding is generally from not a lot of difference in terms of yield between mid-September and sort of about the 10th of October, at the end of that first week in October. After that, your yield sometimes did drop off, but often not hugely, even when you went out into November. But if you get into sort of late sowing, you really need to make sure that slugs aren't an issue, because they will just take it out. And if you have a slugs as a potential issue, earlier sowing won't avoid the situation, but it will certainly reduce the risk or the level of damage and give the crop a chance to get away from them. But in terms of sowing date, yeah, you can sow it sort of from the mid of September. People are tempted to sow it a bit earlier, but what we've noticed is even sowing in mid-September, you tend to increase your disease levels, particularly brown rust, in the following season quite a bit compared to when you sow sort of in early October. So sowing early, you can do it, but maybe you do increase your disease risk. I suppose another positive for it is it's got very good nutrient and particularly nitrogen use efficiency, and because of that, it kind of a good carbon footprint. I'll just go back to this is a separate trial that we did. It's actually, anyone who was at the Open Day this year, you might have seen this trial where we're comparing wheat and barley at wheat and rye at different nitrogen rates. And this was in a take-all risk situation, and it's obviously a very dry year as well, which rye has a very deep extensive rooting system and very good in droughty situations, as I said earlier. So this year really suited the rye in this situation. And when we looked at, so what we did was we put on different rates of nitrogen, and then the little diamond is sort of the economic optimum, the rate of nitrogen to give you your maximum return in terms of money. And what we're finding is that you were getting a higher yield with less nitrogen with the rye. And if you were to do a carbon footprint on that, because of the higher yield and the lower nitrogen input, that the rye would have a significantly lower carbon footprint in this case. And you're obviously putting in less nitrogen. Now, the optimum in this case was 200 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. We wouldn't recommend you put that much on rye, because you're into the red zone in terms of lodging. So we typically recommend sort of about 170, 180 kilos of nitrogen per hectare for rye in this situation. But I suppose not to over-exaggerate it, just coming back to this previous graph, if we're growing rye in this sort of first crop after a break crop, then the differences between the two crops are a lot less, and obviously your carbon footprint benefit wouldn't be quite as, there'd be very little difference in your carbon footprint in that situation. I suppose the other reason is it's got quite good disease resistance to a range of diseases. I've mentioned the take-all already, and we've seen slides there where it outperforms both wheat and barley in a take-all situation. When rye came first, and we started working on it, there were sort of indications that it didn't get BYDV, or you didn't need to spray it with an insecticide. But that was something we weren't sure about, and when we looked in the literature, it suggested that rye did get BYDV, so that was something that we needed to look into as to, what was the story? Did you need to spray it, or did it get BYDV? And we did some trials where we compared rye with winter barley, and on the right-hand side you can see that we were able to show quite clearly that rye does get BYDV with sort of similar symptoms to what barley shows, what it shows up at on barley. On the left-hand side is a picture taken of barley from that trial, sown the same day side by side, and this picture was taken in early April, and you can see quite clearly that there's lots of BYDV there present in the crop. But in the rye, you wouldn't have seen any BYDV in the crop on that day. It's usually only after the crop heads out that we've seen the BYDV come through. So it's not as visible, so you might be forgiven for thinking it didn't get BYDV, but when you go through the crop after it's headed out, you probably will find some little bit of BYDV. So the next question was, well, is it robin yield, or how much can you get back by putting insecticide on it? So this was a trial where we either had rye on spray with no insecticide, or with a standard insecticide program, which was two insecticides, the first at the 2 to 3 leaf stage, and the second in early November. We did get a yield benefit. So the fact that there's two different letters tells us that there was a significant yield increase in response to insecticide application, which tells us that the BYDV was taking some yield. On the barley sown at the same time in the same trial, we also got a very significant yield increase, but it was a much bigger yield increase compared to where the rye. So the rye is only giving us not even 50% of the yield response compared to what we were getting with barley as a result of insecticide application. So it does get BYDV, it does need to get insecticide, but the response is a lot less than you would get with barley. Now, all the work we've done with the BYDV so far has been early sowing, so sown around the 20th of September. Did some work last year looking at sort of October sown rye to see did you still get a response to insecticide, but we just didn't have any BYDV, so we didn't really get any response. I suppose in terms of, so we've looked at the BYDV in terms of the foliar diseases. It does get a lot of foliar diseases, but the two main ones are brown rust and mildew. And I suppose if you were to pick diseases that you wanted to have in your crop that you could control, they might be two you would pick, because we've got reasonably effective chemistry that will control them. The brown rust is probably the biggest threat that there is. On the BYDV, the point has just come back to me. We sprayed our plots twice, so the rye twice, or our growth stage, 12, 13, and at in early November. I've done a bit of work since that has shown that you don't really need to put on that first insecticide. If you put on one insecticide on in sort of early November, it's as good as the two insecticide program. So you can save yourself an insecticide there if needs be. On the foliar disease, as I said, brown rust and mildew are the issue. Earlier sowing does seem to increase, particularly the amount of brown rust you get. So we did some fungicide trials. I'm not going to present the results today. And the earlier fungicide trials that we did were based on rye that was sown sort of in early October, and we were getting very low responses to fungicides, so maybe 0.3, 0.4 of a tonne per hectare. But the last couple of years we've been doing our fungicide trials on rye that was sown sort of around about that 20th of September date, and we'll be getting far bigger responses, 2-3 tonnes a hectare. So the earlier sowing does tend to increase your risk from foliar diseases. It does get a whole range of diseases. It does get things like ramularia, microdochium. There's a whole range of diseases it does get, but we've never seen them at levels that would be you'd be worried about, that you would do anything you would go out and try and control, if you like. I suppose I sort of mentioned the drought conditions. It's got a very deep, extensive root system, which means it can go and look for water that maybe other crops mightn't be able to get, and it's sort of, the international work would suggest that it needs 20 to 30% less water per kilogram of dry matter produced, so very water efficient, if you like. And that could be something that becomes more important as we go forward. We're seeing a lot more of these long dry spells during the growing season, and maybe something that's good able to tolerate those conditions would be quite useful in a rotation. I suppose the other thing that we've noticed is it does appear to be able to tolerate poor weather at harvest better than other cereals. So if you're getting sort of a lot of wet, windy weather, it does tend to be able to stand up to that a little bit better than, say, wheat or barley. But it's not all positive. There are some negatives. I suppose probably one of the main ones from an agronomic point of view is that it's very susceptible to slug damage, much more so than wheat or barley. In terms of advice on slugs, if you have very high slug populations, I would say rye probably isn't the crop in that case. I would always try to cultivate after harvest of the previous crop to try and disrupt the slugs, reduce the number of slug eggs, reduce the number of slugs, and reduce the risk. At sowing, a fine, firm seed bed is really essential to slow down the movement of the slugs, and roll after sowing. And if we could, we'd try to roll twice ourselves in the trials. Slug pellets, they can help. But they're not going to prevent all grazing, and I wouldn't be relying, if you have a decent slug population, I wouldn't rely completely on slug pellets, because they won't have the same effect as they might have in wheat or barley in terms of reducing the amount of grazing. And as I said earlier, sowing earlier can help get the crop past the slug risk period, but it certainly doesn't prevent it. We've had rye sown sort of mid-September, quite badly damaged by slugs as well. So it's not in a high population situation. It's not a cure. I suppose two other ones. It's a tall crop, so there's a risk of lodging, and because it's a tall crop, there's a lot of straw, so you have a slower harvest. I would be a lot less worried about the risk of lodging now than I was when we started growing this, because it's not as prone to lodging as its height would suggest. It can lodge, no question about that, but it's got a very strong straw, so it's usually not the straw that actually breaks or buckles, it's the root system. And if you've got a good seed bed produced, the root system can usually do a fair job at withstanding the forces that are being exerted on it, and lodging hasn't been a huge issue for us. It does break down at harvest, or it does lean over at harvest, which can sort of tangles a little bit at times, can slow down the harvest, but usually, even if it does brackle, the heads are above the soil level, and you can get them with the combine. But look, I suppose the big one, and I'm glad to see that there's people talking about the market, that is the big issue. There's a very limited market, and even if you do get a market, it's often at a discounted price to say wheat or barley, or definitely to wheat, but probably to barley at times as well. So I suppose if you're going to thinking about growing rye, you need to make sure you have the market before you grow it. Don't grow it and hope that someone will buy it off you, because you just might find it difficult to shift it. Now, I'm not an animal nutritionist, but we did locate some data that the nutritionists in Teagasc suggest is quite reliable from INRA, France, which is a French version of Teagasc, if you like, where they've developed feeding values, if you like. This UFL is a measure of its usefulness for milk production in terms of its net energy, and you've metabolizable energy, sort of two measures of energy, if you like, and they're putting sort of rye somewhere between wheat and barley, not as good as maize, so quite a useful. Certainly, you could sum up from this, it's at least as good as barley on maybe a little bit better on these two metrics. There are other metrics that you can take into account as well. I suppose in terms of protein, which is sometimes an important issue in terms of ruminant feeds as well, it is lower. It tends to be lower in protein than either wheat or barley. I would say these values probably exaggerate the difference maybe a little bit compared to some of the work that we've done, but this is what they've produced, and all this data is available on this website, and there's a whole pile of other data there as well that allows you to compare various different feeds with one another. As I say, I'm not a nutritionist, so I'm not going to say too much more about that. Just on the protein, what we found is that yes, it can have a lower protein. This is getting back to the two graphs I showed you earlier, with the first wheat where there was no yield difference, and the second wheat where the rye was outperforming the wheat. And you can see in the first wheat situation, or the first crop situation, Not a huge difference in terms of protein in that instance, but where you are getting the higher yield from the rye, then obviously you're diluting the protein that's there. But I didn't present it today, but when you look into it, the rye is actually accumulating more nitrogen than the wheat, or it's making more protein per hectare in the wheat than the wheat. It's getting more nitrogen out of the soil, if you like, basically, than the wheat. So the difference isn't as big as the yield difference would maybe indicate that it should be. But it does, and if I put up data for the barley, it would have a lower protein than the barley in those trials that I showed you because of the huge yield difference that there was. So I suppose in summary then, why would you grow it? Well, it's a high-yielding crop, suitable for early sowing, that you can spread your autumn workload a little bit. Very good in take-all situations, good end-use efficiency, good carbon footprint. But it's not all positives. There's some agronomic challenges. I mentioned the slugs and some others. But I suppose the big drawback is the market. And I suppose, can we do something to move the market a little bit? And then I suppose just as a wrap up, we have all the work we did in this project we have put together in a rye grower's guide. It will have all the information that we have, up-to-date information that we have to date.
So that's it for today, and my thanks to Richie for his contribution at the Crops Forum. We'll be back next week with more from the Crops Forum, where we'll feature follow-up talks from Michael McKeown in Teagasc and Professor John O'Doherty in UCD to outline where rye can fit in the pig diet. So finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.